All right, so welcome back. Now we're going to find out what happens when the gods go up against Grandma Tiamat. And actually at this point, I've noticed that actually Anu and Anshar do get involved. It seems like it's more of a civil war among the gods. Some of them take Tiamat's side, some of them do not. They take the side of basically Ea and the younger generations. So I feel like Ea's generation is kind of the leaders of this rebellion or revolution or whatever you want to call it. And then certain members of the older generation, like Anshar and Anu, get involved as well. But they wouldn't be able to have a victory without Marduk. So listen to some of, so this is the birth of Marduk in the place called Apsu. And listen to some of the things that are described about Marduk. His body was filled with an ever-blazing flame. He marshaled the four winds to fight Tiamat. They were a gift from his father Anu. He created whirlwinds like the Imhulu wind, the tornado. He raised his flood weapon. He mounted the storm chariot with horses named Slayer, Pitiless, Racer, and Flyer. Their lips were drawn back. Their teeth carried poison. He was clothed in a cloak of awesome armor. His head was crowned with a terrible radiance. He has an herb to counter poison. He has all sorts of cool stuff. And he is beautiful and glorious. At his birth, it says, proud was his form, piercing was his stare, mature his emergence, he was powerful from the start. His limbs were ingeniously made beyond comprehension, impossible to understand, too difficult to perceive. He's so strong, you don't even know how his arms work. Four were his eyes, four were his ears. When his lips moved, fire blazed forth. The four ears were enormous, and likewise the eyes, they perceived everything. Highest among the gods, his form was outstanding. His limbs were very long, his height outstanding. Anu cried out, Sun, majesty, majesty of the gods. 5 fearsome rays were clustered above him. He made the flood wave and stirred up Tiamat. So there's all of the different descriptors that are associated with Marduk. So in summary, Marduk is beautiful, he's perfect, he's strong, and it might not surprise you to know that this poem, this creation myth, was originally told at the religious rituals of Marduk. So when you're worshiping Marduk, you get to this point in the song, you know, you're doing all these rituals, you're having this whole march through the city celebrating Marduk in the city of Babylon, and he's kind of almost like the patron god of Babylon. He is being celebrated, and so you talk about all the things that make him amazing and wonderful. Now, what kind of God is he? Well, on one level, the best identification of him is as a sun god, because he's got those rays coming off. He's very bright and beautiful and majestic. He sees everything, like the sun watches over the earth, you know, and looks down on us and sees everything, stuff like that. But he's also kind of got some storm imagery and wind associated with him. And it's kind of fun that this, in a way, actually makes sense because, you know, storms and wind have to do with the heat of the sun that kind of causes temperatures to fluctuate as much as anything else. And his winds seem more like they're sort of scorching winds, desert winds type of stuff. So Marduk's got a lot going on, but he is a god of the skies. He's a god of the weather. So he kind of has some feeling of Zeus. And we think, some scholars think if you go far back enough, you get to sort of a sky god who is kind of the archetype of the king of the gods. And Marduk is going to become the king of the gods, just like Zeus did. And so Marduk is the guy that all the other gods turn to. They say, you know, we can't do this without you. You are the one to lead the charge against Tiamat. And so Marduk does. He prepares his net and he prepares winds and floods to go up against Tiamat. Now, it's interesting that Tiamat at this point, some of the gods are on her side, but she is getting more and more monstrous. She gives birth to monsters. So she's gone from being sort of this mother goddess figure to being a mother goddess who who spawns sort of monsters to destroy the more human and more relatable gods, the gods who are the gods of the cities of Babylon. So Tiamat gives birth to monsters, and she becomes monstrous herself. She starts being described as more and more monstrous. Later, she's described as having an udder and a tail. So she's some sort of weird dragon creature. In fact, this is where Dungeons and Dragons got the idea of Tiamat, the mother of all the evil dragons, as some sort of like five-headed dragon thing. But Tiamat definitely has some sort of dragon slash snake thing going on. Honestly, if you go this far back in history, there's not really a clear distinction between dragons and snakes. But she is someone who spawns monsters to fight. These include a horned serpent, a mushu dragon, a lamu hero, an ogalu demon, a rabid dog, and a scorpion man, umu demons, a fish man, and a bull man, bearing merciless weapons, fearless in battle. Her orders were so powerful they could not be disobeyed. So she is now this sort of evil queen, but also sort of this monster queen. Almost makes me think of Sleeping Beauty, where the evil queen turns into a dragon. So Tiamat is quite like that, but she's getting more and more monstrous. She doesn't have any human form at all. Marduk is the only one who's strong enough to face her, and he leads them into battle, and he defeats her. Oh, pardon me. And they yell at her for trying to destroy them. Just because the sons were noisy and disrespectful to their father, should you who give them birth reject compassion? And there's kind of a thing here where it's implied that her vizier, Quingu, I'm going to say Quingu, is the lover of Tiamat at this point, and is kind of the one who's running a lot of the sort of power over the gods. He has the Tablet of Destinies. So he is in charge of fate. He controls what happens in the universe. And so if the gods want to win, they're going to need to take that from him. So Marduk slays Tiamat, and he defeats Kingu, and Marduk takes the Tablet of Destinies naturally. So now Marduk is basically in control of the universe and the king of the gods, and they smash up Tiamat's body. And this is something that's really interesting. Remember how they took Apsu's body and they made it into their own house? Now they're going to take Tiamat's body and they're going to make it into the universe. They basically make the body into the world. It's a very interesting choice. Smashed in the skull, carry away the blood, then divided the monstrous shape and created marvels for it. Marduk sliced Tiamat in half like a fish for drying. Half of her he put up to roof the sky. There's that firmament idea again. So half of her body becomes the firmament. He drew a bolt across and made a guard hold it. Her waters he arranged so they could not escape. Now, are we supposed to think of this as blood or literal water, or maybe it doesn't even matter? But we know that Tiamat was the god of the salt waters. So now she is this water figure, but he's using part of her body to hold the inherent waters of her body back. So again, we have this idea, just like we had in the Abrahamic creation myth, we have a firmament. They don't use that word, but it's kind of implied here. The same concept, this solid object that is the sky. Holds back Tiamat's waters. And when it rains, the traditional Babylonian word would imply sort of opening the gates of the sky to cause it to rain. Marduk puts a bolt across the firmament and sort of, gates it off so that the water doesn't come and rain down. And then he does some more work on Apsu. He builds a great shrine there. And he also creates new shrines throughout the world. He sets up the constellations, which, more sky stuff. He makes the moon appear. He makes the clouds. He actually creates the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. They are Tiamat's eyes, which he lets water flow from her eyes, which is kind of sad, actually. It's like she's crying. He makes the mountains from her udder and her tail. he basically makes everything out of everything in the world out of different pieces of Tiamat's body. So that's Tiamat's legacy. The um, she was the mother. She was actually being nice to the gods, and then they started a ruckus, and it ended up in a fight where she was trying to destroy her own children. But then they sort of butchered her and made the world out of her. Now, does this remind you of anything? One thing that it kind of reminds me of is in Norse mythology, people making the world out of the bodies of the giants. Well, specifically, Ymir was the giant who the world was made out of. And so they chopped them up into pieces and made the different parts into different parts of the world. So this is something we see in a lot of different places. It's the idea of a primordial entity whose body became the world. It seems kind of brutal, but if you just think of it as this process of there was one thing and then it transformed into the world, that starts to make a little more sense. And here it's Tiamat. Yeah, and at this point, Marduk, he's so great. He is the guy who provides the shrines for the gods. And actually, it's kind of implied at this point the gods were just worshiping each other. And he says, no, 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 I'm going to create some people and they'll take care of that. They will be the ones who worship, you guys. And you don't have to worship each other, which is pretty great. And of course, he creates the great city of Babylon, which is where all this stuff is, happening. This is where the story is being told. So, that's a pretty big deal. It's kind of like, and then he created Washington, D.C., it would have that same sort of feeling. And he basically takes all the gods who had battled against him, and, he declares punishments or he gets them on his side. Either he offers them mercy or he destroys them. And so he creates mankind, as I said, to be the worshippers of the gods. In a way, it kind of reminds me of what's going on in the Abrahamic story, but also it's kind of its own thing. There it was like Adam is there to cultivate to have dominion over the animals of the earth, or alternatively to be God's sort of assistant gardener. But here Marduk is doing it to bring worship to the gods, which is fun. And it's implied that that's the way it should be. Human beings should be worshiping the gods, and Marduk, like Zeus in certain ways, is creating the norms of society, the rules of the way things are. So that's basically the deal with Marduk. And let's see. Anything else we want to mention? No, I guess I just want to say there's sometimes, it seems like they draw a distinction between the two groups of gods here. The Igigi gods are kind of the older gods who were allied with Tiamat. And then, the Igigi gods are Marduk's group. And then there's also an older group of gods. And I want to double check their name here. There might not actually be a name for them. But the Igigi seem to be the ones who are allied with Marduk. Let's see. Yeah. So the Igigi gods are the younger group of gods. Okay, so there's a lot to think about here. The sort of transformation of Tiamat from like a benevolent, more human-like figure to a monstrous figure who's just basically a weird dragon that needs to be slain by a hero. That's pretty interesting. And so if we think about the sort of tone here, what's the sort of attitude towards gender roles that we're seeing in this story, or towards male and female? We have this mother goddess who then becomes a mother of monsters. And then we have this very beautiful, perfect, strong, heroic male hero god who eventually becomes the king of the gods. And if we look back to other myths, I think the thing that reminds me of the most is the tension between Zeus and Gaia, which is not something that was directly in Hesiod, but or at least not the parts that we've read as much. But Zeus has to go up against the monstrous children of Gaia, including the giants. So Gaia is the mother of these giants whose name means something like born from the earth. And so these are among the enemies that Zeus has to slay to be king of the universe. So he goes up against Gaia. And what is Gaia? She's the world. Gaia was, the world. The world was created from her, and so it just inherently was her. So there's a weird kind of similarity there. We have this goddess who basically represents the world, and then we have this male god who takes charge and is having to contend against her and her sort of tricky nature, and ultimately defeats her. And then again, as we saw with Zeus before, we have a lot of patterns where Zeus is kind of defeating these goddesses, taking their power for himself, and establishing himself as the leader of this patriarchal, meaning led by men, society. Additionally, one of the children of Gaia is a monster known as Typhon, or Typheus. And he is a very wild creature. Sometimes he's said to have 100 heads. Other times he's said to have 100 legs, or sometimes his legs are snakes. He's got a lot of different stuff going on. And so he is this sort of monster that Zeus ends up slaying, or in some versions of the story, he's buried beneath a volcano in Italy. And when he turns over in his sleep, that's when the volcano erupts. But yeah, he's a monster sent forth by Gaia that Zeus needs to slay. And there's also a figure in Greek mythology known as Echidna, who is the mother of monsters. We don't have a whole lot of good images of Echidna, so here's one from modern sculpture of her. She is depicted as being sort of this half-part snake creature. Again, kind of like what they're doing on with Gaia. Gaia is associated with the earth, and snakes are associated with the earth. The giants often have snake parts to them. And so Echidna is this goddess who basically only exists to be the ancestor of all these different kinds of monsters. In some stories, she's the mother of Typhon and other figures. Or sometimes she's the mother of Cerberus or the Chimera. And so we have, again, a figure who is this monster mother figure and is ultimately an enemy of the gods and of sort of normal order of society. So if we compare that to what's going on in the Enuma Elish, we have a similar sort of thing. And so it seems like there's this sort of pattern going on with the gender roles of the male god kind of vilifying the female goddess, who is like being thought of as a mother, but then the story goes on to say, well, no, but she's a mother of monsters too. So is she benevolent? Ultimately, no. Ultimately, she's an enemy that has to be destroyed. And I don't know, when you think about this, doesn't this seem kind of like defensive in a way? Like, oh, those mother goddesses, they're not, they're not good. They're not responsible for any good things at all. It's us sort of male hero gods, us Zeus types who deserve to be in charge. And one interesting theory about this, now I have to stress this is just a theory, and there's a lot of debate over this question, but one theory about this is that maybe the religion started off having more emphasis on the mother goddesses, and then later on it drifted more towards the male gods. One interesting thing we see is that the cult of Hera, who is mostly just known as the wife of Zeus, Hera was worshipped from really, really, really ancient times, like, going pretty far back in Greece. And it seems like she might have possibly been worshipped before she was associated in any way with Zeus. If you go back to the older statues, it's kind of more like Zeus is like her sort of little partner, and then they're represented as equals. And then eventually, Zeus is represented as in a dominant position of authority, and Hera is just his wife. But it kind of puts a different spin on Hera being the jealous wife character, that maybe she was a primordial, powerful goddess in her own right that just kind of got taken over and co-opted by the cult of Zeus. That's the theory anyway. And some people have seen there being this larger pattern of, maybe it was all mother goddesses originally. Maybe the original sort of mythic religion was fertility. You see that goddesses have the power over life because women have the power over life, have this power over birth and whatnot. And so maybe that causes the earliest religions to be religions of mother goddesses. Then later on, as men take more and more power, they take over this religion and set up their own male sort of figures as the ones who are supposed to be in charge. And the myth would kind of reflect that accordingly. That's one theory. The other theory is that, it's just always inherently, even if you don't have a story process like that historically, where the mother goddesses give way to the male gods, women are a threat in a certain way to male authority because they can defy it. And so women are being depicted as tricky. And so the defensiveness would then, in this interpretation, be just like saying, don't get any ideas. Don't think that just because you are associated with birth, that gives you power to defeat Zeus. That Zeus is ultimately the one who should be in charge. And I realize we're talking a lot about Zeus in our thing about Marduk, but it's the same exact story about Marduk. Marduk is the one who should be in charge in this sort of male-dominated society, and he deserves to be the king of the gods. And a powerful, leading, authoritative male figure is on top, and the goddess figure, she ultimately just gets turned into the world. She's the world. She's not a player in her own right, not anymore. That's the idea. And that's why we have to vilify her, because she's threatening to the order of society. If people were just going around worshiping Tiamat, that wouldn't work for the city of Marduk. That's the idea anyway. And so some people speculate about mother goddesses. We do know that there are a lot of figurines that we found in Europe that have been preserved from like prehistoric times, from like before any civilization. We find these figurines of these very feminine figures. Now, I say mother goddess figurines. We want to call them mother goddess figurines. The fact is, we don't really have any idea what they were used for. We do know that they have a very feminine presence, and they emphasize body parts like the breast and hips, suggesting maybe some sort of association with fertility and sexuality, or the power of life, or the power of birth. These are all very plausible interpretations of these figurines. This one's from Greece. It's more of a skinny type of thing. This one basically has no head. It's all, body, all sort of breast and hips and belly. And so one interpretation is that these might actually be self-portraits by prehistoric women, looking down and sort of de-emphasizing the head and more emphasizing the rest of the body. But it certainly is interesting that this is the pattern. So we might want to say of this idea of a mother goddess culture, but we don't know that for sure. Another thing we know is that there was kind of a movement of more patriarchal culture over time. A lot of the cultures in Europe and Mesopotamia and Turkey, and even some parts of the Middle East and Russia, were influenced by a culture we call the Indo-Europeans, who we mostly know about from following the patterns of language and a little bit of DNA. That they started off from a region around here and spread out to all these other cultures. Oh, India as well, including India over here. That's why they're Indo-Europeans. And so all these cultures could have been, influenced by a patriarchal culture coming in and changing the way things were thought about, changing the norms of how the mythology worked. It's plausible. Now, to be fair, in other parts of the world like China, we also see patriarchal cultures emerge as well. So it may not be that simple. But that's the idea of it anyway. It used to be a more sort of like, oh yes, we know this for sure. Now people are realizing it's kind of hard to prove anything that happens before there's any written records or even any mythology to speak of. But it's a very interesting notion. And we do know that gods like Zeus, Thor, and Indra, all these gods associated with thunder and lightning and the sky, were part of this culture. And so they certainly had some cultural connections over time. But you have to go really far back here. This is before any writing. So, take your pick. Is it the gods coming in and changing the mythology, or is it a situation where the gods are just defensive of their own power, and the men in this culture are defensive of their own power? We certainly saw that fathers were suspicious that their children might make alliance with their mothers against them. And then the child grows up, and then they have to join male culture, and then the mothers are threatening once again. So that's all for today's discussion. Next time, though, we're going to talk about Isis and Osiris, and how Isis has a different kind of relationship to the male gods. And we'll also compare her to a different Mesopotamian god, um, uh, who is Inanna, or Ishtar. There's a goddess who kind of falls outside of this framework and is a little bit more capable of holding her own power in Mesopotamia. Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to think, is there anything else I wanted to mention about the sort of Jewish Babylonian connection? Well, we've talked about before. Basically, the idea is that when the Jews were writing down their own creation myth, they noticed that there was this Babylonian creation myth. Indeed, they couldn't have escaped it because it was the dominant culture of the city of Babylon. Um, and that creation myth was all about water. So the Jewish creation myth also became all about water. But they said, no, it's water, but no, it's not your gods taking the water and shaping it into the universe. It's our God. Our God takes the water and he separates the waters from the waters, and he puts the rainwater in the sky. But your God, it's not the story of Marduk. It's the story of Yahweh, or however you want to pronounce the ancient Jewish name of God, or not pronounce. And so that's our Hebrew writer P, who lived in Babylon, arguing against the Babylonian version of the story. That's the theory anyway, but pretty darn plausible. Okay, and now that truly is it for today. So our discussion question today is, yeah, basically, what do you think of all of this? So we'll dig into that, and I'll look forward to hearing your answers. And the next time we will officially meet and talk about the sort of different and maybe more powerful, maybe not, role played by Isis in Egypt. All right, see you then.